July 2016, Royston, Hertfordshire. For more than 3 months, police have been searching for 51-year-old author Helen Bailey. Her fiancé, Stewart, has told investigators that Helen walked out of their home after leaving a note saying she needed space. He has spoken publicly about her disappearance. He has appeared to be the devastated partner waiting for her to come home. But detectives are no longer convinced. They return to the £1.5 million property Helen shared with Stewart and begin searching the garage. Under the floor is an old Victorian cesspit. The space is filthy, dark, and difficult to access. Police open it. Inside, they find the body of Helen Bailey. Beside her is the body of her dog, Boris. The discovery destroys the story Stewart has repeated for months. Helen never walked away. She never began a secret new life. She had been inside the property the entire time. And the man who claimed to be waiting for her return had parked her car over the place where her body was hidden. The investigation will reveal something even more disturbing. Helen had the sleeping drug Zopiclone in her system. Prosecutors would argue that Stewart had secretly drugged her so she would be too sedated to resist while he suffocated her. Within hours of her death, he increased a standing order transferring money from Helen's bank account to his own. Then he attempted to use a power of attorney to gain control of her finances, while everyone else still believed she was missing. The motive was not grief. It was money. And years later, when police reopened the death of Stewart's first wife, Diane, forensic evidence would lead to a second murder conviction. Before we reconstruct how a respected author disappeared inside her own home and how her fiancé maintained the lie for 3 months, subscribe to the channel. Every case here is rebuilt from court records, police findings, forensic evidence, and verified reporting rather than rumor or invented drama. If you want detailed true crime investigations like this, subscribe now so you do not miss the next case. Now, let us go back to April 2016, because Helen's disappearance began with a story that initially sounded believable. Helen Bailey was already well known before the murder investigation made her name national news. She was a successful writer whose books for younger readers included the Electra Brown series. She had built a career through humor, fiction, and an ability to connect with readers. Her personal life, however, had already been marked by loss. Helen had been married to John Sinfield. In 2011, he died suddenly while the couple were on holiday in Barbados. Helen later wrote publicly about grief and bereavement. That experience eventually connected her with Stewart. Stewart had also lost a spouse. His wife, Diane Stewart, died in 2010. At the time, Diane's death was treated as the result of an epileptic seizure. No murder charge followed. No one yet had reason to connect her death to what would later happen to Helen. Helen and Stewart met through a bereavement group. Their relationship developed. Eventually, they became engaged and moved into Helen's home in Royston. From the outside, Stewart appeared to have rebuilt his life after tragedy. Helen appeared to have done the same. But their financial positions were very different. Helen was wealthy. The court would later hear that her estate was worth several £million. She had also made generous financial provision for Stewart if she died. That fact would become central to the prosecution's case. The judge who later sentenced Stewart concluded that his principal motive was financial gain. He knew he stood to benefit if Helen died. He also knew that if she simply disappeared and remained missing long enough, the law could eventually presume her dead. But Stewart did not wait for that process before trying to access her money. On April 11, 2016, Helen was last seen alive. The next day, Stewart began telling people that she was missing. His explanation depended on a note. According to Stewart, Helen had left a message saying she needed space and did not want him to contact her. There was another detail that made the disappearance unusual. Helen's dog, Boris, was also missing. Friends and relatives knew how devoted she was to the animal. If Helen had left intentionally, taking Boris could make sense. If someone had killed Helen but left the dog behind, Boris could undermine the story. The sentencing judge later concluded that Stewart killed the dog because Helen was so devoted to him that any disappearance story would have to include Boris as well. The lie needed both of them to vanish. Stewart told police and Helen's family that he had no idea where she had gone. He presented himself as the abandoned fiancé. But on the day Helen died, he had already begun changing her financial arrangements. Within hours, Stewart used his knowledge of her accounts and his computer skills to increase an existing standing order from Helen's bank account to his own. Stewart also had access to a power of attorney Helen had granted him. While she was officially treated as a missing person, he attempted to use that authority to take greater control over her financial affairs. The prosecution said this exposed the real purpose of the disappearance story. Helen did not need to be declared dead immediately. She only needed to be absent long enough for Stewart to begin controlling the life she had built. The police investigation initially focused on locating her. Searches were carried out. Appeals were made. Friends and relatives waited for contact. Stewart continued repeating the same explanation. Helen had gone away. Helen needed space. Helen did not want to be contacted. But detectives began finding inconsistencies. One important question concerned Helen's movements. If she had left voluntarily, where was the evidence that she had traveled? Where were the transactions, communications, or sightings showing a wealthy, recognizable author beginning a new life? There was also the problem of her dog. Taking Boris made the story emotionally believable, but it also meant Stewart had to account for two disappearances rather than one. As police examined the property and Stewart's behavior, suspicion moved closer to the home. The house itself eventually became the focus. Investigators had searched areas before, but the old cesspit beneath the garage proved difficult. It was concealed below the floor and covered by Helen's car. That positioning mattered. The vehicle was not simply parked somewhere on the property. It was directly over the hidden space containing the bodies. In July 2016, police returned. This time they searched the cesspit. Helen's body had been dumped there. Boris had been placed there as well. The discovery changed the case instantly. The missing person investigation became a murder investigation. The note Stewart described no longer explained an absence. It became part of a deliberate deception. The car over the cesspit was no longer an ordinary parking choice. It became part of the concealment. And Stewart's financial actions could now be examined against the knowledge that Helen had already been dead when he made them. A post-mortem examination could not establish every detail easily because Helen had been hidden in the cesspit for months. Decomposition complicated the forensic picture. But toxicology produced a crucial result. Zopiclone was detected. Zopiclone is a sedative medication commonly prescribed for insomnia. Stewart had obtained the drug from his doctor. The prosecution argued that he secretly administered it to Helen to make her drowsy and less capable of resisting. The sentencing judge accepted that Stewart had planned the murder in advance, sedated Helen with Zopiclone, and then suffocated her when she was too impaired to fight him effectively. A pillow was part of the prosecution case. The judge concluded Stewart used it to suffocate Helen, and then removed and disposed of the pillowcase in the cesspit with the bodies. The Crown's case was preparation, drug, sedation, suffocation, concealment, then financial gain. The sequence made the murder look less like an emotional explosion and more like a project Stewart had planned around Helen's trust. All of those conditions already existed inside the relationship. Helen trusted Stewart. She had agreed to marry him. She had given him power of attorney. She had made financial provision for him. The prosecution argued that he converted each sign of trust into an advantage. The power of attorney became a route toward control. The financial provision became motive. The home became the murder scene. And the cesspit beneath the garage became the hiding place. Stewart was arrested. He denied murdering Helen. The case eventually reached St. Albans Crown Court. During the trial, prosecutors reconstructed the disappearance as a carefully staged fraud. Stewart had not simply killed Helen and panicked. He created a narrative designed to delay discovery. The supposed note was central. Helen was presented as emotionally overwhelmed. Stewart repeatedly told people she needed space. The account exploited what friends knew about her previous grief and anxiety. But the prosecution asked the jury to compare the story with the evidence. A woman supposedly walked away from a wealthy life without leaving a reliable trail. Her dog disappeared with her. Her body was eventually found beneath the garage of the home she shared, with the man claiming not to know where she was. That same man increased payments from her bank account almost immediately. He tried to use power of attorney while she was missing. Her toxicology showed a drug he had access to. And her car was positioned over the cesspit where the bodies were hidden. The defense challenged the prosecution case, but the accumulation of evidence was powerful. On February 22, 2017, the jury convicted Ian Stewart of Helen Bailey's murder. He was also convicted of offenses connected with fraud, preventing the lawful and decent burial of a body, and perverting the course of justice. The following day, he returned to court for sentencing. The judge's remarks were unusually direct. He described the murder as planned well in advance. He concluded Stewart's principal motive was to gain access to Helen's wealth. The court accepted that Stewart had secretly administered Zopiclone to sedate her before suffocating her. The judge also emphasized the killing of Boris and the 3 months of lies told to Helen's family and friends. The court considered the murder particularly serious because it was committed for gain and involved significant planning and premeditation. Stewart was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 34 years. He was 56 years old. The sentence meant he would be nearly 90 before becoming eligible to apply for parole. But Helen Bailey's case did not end with that sentence. The conviction caused investigators to reconsider another death. 6 years before Helen was murdered, Stewart's first wife, Diane, had died at the family home. Diane Stewart was 47. Her death in 2010 had originally been attributed to an epileptic seizure. That explanation had stood for years. But now police knew Ian Stewart had murdered a later partner inside a domestic setting. The earlier death could no longer be viewed in isolation. Investigators reopened Diane's case. This time, they had access to evidence that had not been examined as part of a murder inquiry in 2010. Most importantly, preserved tissue from Diane's brain still existed. Forensic specialists examined it. The results contradicted the original explanation. The evidence showed that Diane had not died simply because of an epileptic seizure. Experts concluded that her breathing had been deliberately restricted. The similarities to Helen's death were impossible to ignore. 2 women in intimate relationships with the same man. 2 deaths inside domestic settings, both involving interference with breathing. The second investigation transformed Stewart from a man convicted of one murder into the suspect in another. Police also examined the circumstances surrounding Diane's death. Stewart had previously described finding her unresponsive. Her death had seemed medically explainable because of her epilepsy. That condition created a ready-made alternative explanation. Just as Helen's anxiety and grief were later used to support the story that she had voluntarily disappeared, Diane's epilepsy could make a suspicious death appear natural. But in both cases, prosecutors argued that Stewart used what people already knew about the woman to create a believable explanation. Helen was supposedly overwhelmed and needed space. Diane supposedly suffered a fatal seizure. Both explanations initially worked. Years later, both collapsed. Stewart was charged with Diane's murder. The case went to Huntingdon Crown Court. He denied killing her. The prosecution relied heavily on the new forensic examination. Experts explained why the preserved brain tissue did not support the original seizure theory. The evidence indicated asphyxia. Stewart's conviction for Helen Bailey's murder formed part of the broader context, but the jury still had to decide Diane's case on the evidence before it. In February 2022, the jury found Ian Stewart guilty of murdering Diane Stewart. The conviction meant the legal system had now held him responsible for killing both his first wife and his later fiancé. On February 9, 2022, Stewart was sentenced for Diane's murder. The judge imposed a whole life order. At that moment, it meant Stewart would never become eligible for release. The judge considered the combination of the two murders exceptionally serious. Stewart appealed. On July 29, 2022, the Court of Appeal reviewed the whole life order. The court did not overturn Diane's murder conviction. It changed the sentence. The judges concluded that Stewart's crimes, although extremely serious, did not meet the legal threshold required for a whole life order. The whole life order was removed. In its place, the Court of Appeal imposed a minimum term of 35 years. That is the current legal position arising from the appeal. It is important because descriptions that say Stewart remains subject to a whole life order are now outdated. The murder convictions remain. The sentence structure changed. The two murder investigations also reveal a striking feature of Stewart's behavior. He did not need to invent completely unbelievable stories. He built his lies around facts. Diane really did have epilepsy. Helen really had suffered profound grief. Helen really did trust him with financial authority. Boris really was central to Helen. Life, the cesspit really, was hidden beneath the garage. Stewart used real circumstances and changed only the part necessary to conceal what he had done. If Stewart had claimed she was kidnapped by strangers, police would immediately search for an outside offender. If he claimed she had died suddenly, a body would require medical examination. Instead, he said she had chosen to leave. That explanation gave him time. Adults are allowed to disappear voluntarily. A person who wants space does not necessarily contact friends or police. The note created uncertainty rather than a specific event investigators could disprove. And while that uncertainty continued, Stewart tried to gain financially. The standing order is one of the clearest pieces of evidence of timing. The increase occurred within hours of the murder. Not weeks later. Not after a legal presumption of death. Not after a period of financial confusion. Almost immediately. The judge treated that action as part of the evidence that money was the principal motive. Helen had been generous to Stewart. He was already positioned to benefit from her wealth. But the court concluded he wanted more. Marriage would have allowed him to share in her life. Murder offered the possibility of controlling what she left behind. That greed transformed the protections Helen had given him into tools he could use against her. The power of attorney is another example. It existed because Helen trusted him to act in her interests. After she was dead, Stewart attempted to use it while others still believed she was simply missing. A document created to protect Helen became part of the attempt to exploit her absence. The cesspit followed the same pattern. It was part of the property, hidden beneath the garage. Most people would never imagine a body could be concealed there for months. Stewart knew the house. He knew the location. He knew the garage could be used to cover access. Parking Helen's car above it helped hide the place investigators most needed to search. But the plan had a weakness. Helen did not disappear from the world. Her relationships remained. Her career remained. Her family remained. Her finances remained. And each part of that life generated questions Stewart could not answer forever. Why no reliable sighting? Why no communication? Why no financial activity consistent with someone living elsewhere? Why was Boris gone too? Why was Stewart moving money? Why did the trail keep pointing back to the house? The longer the investigation continued, the more the voluntary disappearance theory required people to believe that Helen had abandoned everything without leaving a meaningful trace. Eventually, police stopped treating the absence as the mystery. They treated Stewart's explanation as the mystery. Then they opened the cesspit. The case also changed how Diane Stewart's family understood the past. For years, they had believed Diane died from a medical event. The discovery that her husband had later murdered Helen forced investigators to revisit assumptions made in 2010. The preserved brain tissue became crucial because it allowed modern specialists to ask a different question. Instead of asking whether Diane's death was consistent with epilepsy, they asked whether the physical evidence showed deliberate interference with breathing. That shift in question changed the answer. The original medical explanation no longer held. A death that had been closed for years became a homicide. And Stewart's first wife finally became part of the criminal record attached to him. The significance of evidence can change when new facts emerge. What looked ordinary in one context can become alarming in another. That is what happened here. Helen's murder exposed the possibility that Diane's death had been misunderstood. Then forensic science confirmed that suspicion strongly enough for a jury to convict. The outcome means Stewart's crimes are now understood through two separate victims. Helen Bailey was 51, successful, engaged, and planning a future. Diane Stewart was 47, and had lived an entirely different life with him years earlier. Their deaths were separated by 6 years. The common connection was Ian Stewart. In Helen's case, the motive established by the court was financial gain. The murder was carefully planned. Zopiclone was used to sedate her. She was suffocated. Her body and Boris were hidden in the cesspit. Her finances were targeted almost immediately. Then Stewart lied for 3 months. The investigation that finally exposed him did more than solve one disappearance. It reopened a death everyone had already accepted. That second case resulted in another murder conviction. Stewart once relied on time. Time for Helen to remain missing. Time for people to accept the note. Time for him to take control of her money. Time for the bodies beneath the garage to decompose. Time had also protected the truth about Diane for years. But eventually, time worked in the opposite direction. Police returned to the house. Forensic specialists returned to Diane's preserved tissue. Courts returned to Stewart's history. And two separate stories that once appeared unrelated became part of the same record. Helen Bailey did not walk away from Royston. Diane Stewart did not simply die from the medical event first assumed. Both women were killed by the man they trusted. And the lie that began with a missing author ended with Ian Stewart convicted of 2 murders and facing decades more in prison. If you want more deeply researched true crime cases like this, subscribe now. We break down real investigations, court evidence, and the details most people miss, so make sure you're subscribed for the next case.